A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The blizzard had been building for hours, transforming what had started as a peaceful winter afternoon into a howling nightmare of wind and ice that battered against Sarah's cabin with enough force to make the ancient wooden walls groan and shudder like they were living things in pain. She had been watching the storm's approach from her single frost-covered window, seeing the dark clouds roll over the mountain peaks with an inevitability that made her chest tight with a familiar anxiety, the kind that came from knowing you were about to be trapped alone with nothing but your own thoughts for company, and for someone who had spent the last 6 months in near total isolation. Her thoughts were dangerous territory that she tried desperately to avoid. The cabin was barely more than a shelter, a forgotten structure she had stumbled upon during one of her endless wanderings through the neutral wilderness, its roof sagging in places, and its walls riddled with cracks that let in drafts of frigid air no matter how much she tried to stuff them with cloth and moss. But it was hers in a way nothing had been hers since her parents died 16 years ago. Since the Silverpine Pack had decided that a strange-looking orphan girl with white hair and pale skin was more trouble than she was worth. Sarah moved away from the window and returned to the fire, stirring the thin stew she had been rationing for 3 days because her last hunting trip had yielded almost nothing, and winter game was scarce in this remote region, where even the hardiest trappers rarely ventured. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting features that had caused whispers and turned heads her entire life for all the wrong reasons. Her hair so white it looked like fresh snow, even in the dim light. Her skin so pale it had an almost translucent quality that made the blue veins visible beneath like rivers of ice under frozen lakes, and her eyes a gray so light they appeared almost colorless in certain angles, giving her the unsettling appearance of a ghost or a corpse, or so Julian had told her 5 years ago when he had publicly rejected her at what should have been their mating ceremony. She could still hear his voice echoing in her memory, cruel and clear and carrying across the gathered pack with perfect clarity, telling everyone within earshot that he would rather mate with a tree than spend his life waking up next to something that looked like death itself. And the laughter that had followed his declaration had been worse than the rejection itself, because it meant they all agreed with him. Every single wolf in that clearing had looked at her and found her wanting, found her wrong, found her unworthy of love or acceptance or even basic kindness. "Stop it," Sarah said aloud to the empty cabin, her voice rough from disuse because she had not spoken to another living soul in so long that she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like, a habit she had developed over the months of isolation, talking to herself just to break the oppressive silence that otherwise threatened to swallow her whole. "You're being pathetic again, dwelling on things you cannot change and people who do not deserve even a moment of your mental energy. So just focus on surviving this storm and getting through another night, and maybe, just maybe, tomorrow will be better, even though tomorrow is never actually better, because every day is exactly the same in this endless cycle of surviving without actually living." She ladled some of the watery stew into her only bowl, the ceramic chipped and cracked, but still functional, and carried it to the rickety table that wobbled dangerously every time she set anything on it, settling onto the wooden stool that served as her only chair, and trying not to think about how this was her life now, how this tiny cabin with its drafty walls and meager supplies and crushing loneliness was the best she could hope for, because at least here, in this forgotten corner of the wilderness, no one could look at her with disgust or pity, or that particular combination of both that had followed her through every packed territory she had ever tried to make a home in. The wind outside intensified suddenly, howling like a living thing in pain, and Sarah paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth, listening to the way the storm seemed to be building in fury rather than dying down, as winter storms usually did after a few hours of rage. This was different. She realized, with a cold curl of dread in her stomach, this was the kind of storm that could last for days, the kind that buried entire regions under feet of snow and killed anyone foolish enough to be caught outside without proper shelter. And while her cabin was far from ideal, it was at least walls and a roof and a fire, which was more than most creatures would have in weather like this. She tried to return her attention to her meal, but something kept nagging at her awareness. Some instinct that her parents had trained into her back when they were still alive and teaching her the ways of healing and survival. The kind of instinct that had kept her alive through 5 years of wandering alone through territories that did not want her. And that instinct was telling her that something was wrong, that something beyond the normal danger of the storm was approaching, and she should be alert and ready, even though she had no idea ready for what. The scratching started just after she had finished her stew and was washing her bowl in the bucket of melted snow she kept by the fire, a sound so faint at first that she thought she might be imagining it. Her mind playing tricks after too many months alone with only her own voice for company. But then it came again, more insistent this time, a desperate scraping against the wooden door that sent her heart racing and her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the bowl she was holding, because nothing came to her cabin. Nothing ever approached this isolated place except for the occasional deer or rabbit that she managed to trap for food, and certainly nothing large enough to make that kind of sound against her door. The scratching turned to pounding, heavy and rhythmic and increasingly frantic, accompanied by a sound that made her blood run cold, a whimper that was distinctly canine, but carried with it a note of intelligence and desperation that could only mean one thing. There was a shifter outside her door, and that shifter was in serious trouble if they were reduced to pounding on a stranger's cabin door in the middle of a blizzard, rather than finding their way back to their pack territory. Sarah stood frozen by the fire, every survival instinct she possessed screaming at her to stay inside, to keep the door barred and wait out whatever was happening on her doorstep, because getting involved with other shifters had never ended well for her, had only ever resulted in rejection and pain and the kind of cruelty that came from people who thought they were better than her simply because they looked normal and she did not. But even as those thoughts raced through her mind, even as she tried to convince herself that this was not her problem and she owed nothing to whoever was outside dying in the snow, her feet were carrying her towards the door. Her hands were reaching for the heavy bolt that kept it secured, because underneath all the fear and self-preservation and learned wariness of strangers, she was still a healer at her core, still her parents' daughter, still someone who could not ignore suffering even when ignoring it would be the smart and safe and sensible thing to do. "This is stupid," she whispered to herself as her fingers closed around the bolt, her heart hammering so hard in her chest that she could feel it in her throat, making it difficult to breathe or think or do anything except acknowledge that she was about to do something incredibly dangerous and possibly suicidal. But her hands were already sliding the bolt free, already pulling the door open against the wind that immediately tried to tear it from her grasp. "This is so incredibly stupid, and you are going to die because you cannot just leave well enough alone, because you have to help every creature in pain, even though no one has ever helped you, even though every act of kindness you have ever offered has been repaid with cruelty, or indifference, or both." The door swung inward with enough force to send Sarah stumbling backward, and with it came a wall of snow and freezing wind that stole the breath from her lungs and made her eyes water instantly. But none of that mattered, because sprawled across her threshold, half buried in snow and barely conscious, was the largest wolf she had ever seen in her entire life. It was massive, easily the size of a full-grown alpha and probably larger, with thick white fur that was matted with ice and blood. Its enormous body trembling with cold and pain and exhaustion. And when it lifted its head to look at her with eyes that were the most striking shade of silver blue she had ever witnessed, eyes that held far too much intelligence and awareness to belong to anything other than a shifter, she felt something in her chest twist and tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a recognition she could not begin to name or understand. The wolf tried to crawl forward, to drag itself across her threshold and into the warmth of her cabin, but its strength gave out halfway through the attempt, and it collapsed with a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a growl, its silver blue eyes flickering closed as consciousness began to slip away. And Sarah found herself moving without thought, without hesitation, dropping to her knees in the snow and reaching for the enormous creature, even though every rational part of her brain was shrieking that this was an alpha, that alphas were dangerous, that this one could kill her without even trying if it decided she was a threat. But looking at those wounds, seeing the deep gash that ran from the wolf's shoulder down across its ribs, seeing the unnatural angle of one back leg and the way ice had formed in crystalline patterns across its fur, all she could think was that this magnificent creature was dying, and she was the only chance it had at survival, and she could not, would not, let another life slip away when she had the skills and knowledge to prevent it. Even if those skills were rusty from lack of use, and her supplies were limited, and she had no idea if she could actually save something this badly injured. "Okay," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her shaking hands, talking to the wolf the way she had talked to injured animals her entire life, using words as much to calm herself as to soothe the creature before her. "Okay, you stupid, beautiful wolf. Let us see if I can save your life, because apparently I have learned nothing from 5 years of being hurt by your kind, and I still cannot resist trying to help, even when helping might get me killed." She grabbed the wolf by its front legs, surprised by how heavy and solid it felt, despite being weakened by injuries, and began the slow, exhausting process of dragging it across her threshold and into the cabin, the wolf's dead weight fighting against her every inch of the way, her muscles screaming in protest as she pulled and heaved and struggled to get the massive creature inside before they both froze to death in the open doorway. By the time she finally managed to get the wolf fully inside and kick the door shut against the storm, Sarah was sweating despite the cold, her breath coming in harsh gasps that burned her lungs, her arms trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. But she could not stop to rest because the wolf was barely breathing now, its silver blue eyes closed and its body so still that for a horrible moment she thought she had been too late, that it had died while she was dragging it to safety. But then she saw the faint rise and fall of its chest, the barely perceptible proof of life, and she launched into action with the kind of focused intensity that her parents had drilled into her during her healer training years ago, when she still had a home and a family and some semblance of hope for her future. She built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, grabbed every blanket and towel she owned and spread them on the floor beside the hearth. Then carefully, methodically began the process of examining the wolf's injuries, her healer's senses cataloging every wound and broken bone and dangerous symptom with clinical precision, even as her heart ached for the creature's obvious suffering. The gash across its side was deep, probably from another wolf's claws, judging by the spacing and depth. And it was still bleeding sluggishly despite the cold that should have helped slow the blood loss, which meant the wound was serious enough to need immediate attention, or the wolf would bleed out before morning. 3 ribs were definitely broken. She could feel them shifting wrong beneath her careful fingers, and the back leg was dislocated rather than broken, which was actually better because she could fix a dislocation if she was careful, and the wolf did not wake up and kill her for causing it more pain in the process of helping it. But the hypothermia was what worried her most, because the wolf's body temperature was dangerously low. Low enough that even a shifter's enhanced healing might not be enough to bring it back from the edge, and she had no way of knowing how long it had been out in the storm before it found her cabin. No way of knowing if she had the supplies or skills to reverse cold damage this severe. "You are not allowed to die," Sarah informed the unconscious wolf as she worked, her voice taking on the firm, commanding tone her mother had always used when dealing with difficult patients, as if sheer force of will could keep a person or creature alive through determination alone. "I did not drag your enormous, ridiculously heavy body into my cabin just to have you die on my floor. So you are going to survive this because I said so, and also because I really do not want to have to figure out how to dispose of a dead alpha-sized wolf from my tiny cabin. So let us just agree that living is the better option for both of us." She used her precious store of clean cloth to pack the wound on its side, pressing down hard to staunch the bleeding, while her other hand worked to carefully manipulate the dislocated hip back into place, feeling for the exact angle and position that would allow the joint to slip back where it belonged. And when she finally felt it click into place with a sound that made her slightly nauseous, the wolf made a sound in its unconscious state that might have been pain or might have been relief. And she found herself stroking its head in an unconscious gesture of comfort, her fingers tangling in the thick white fur that was softer than she had expected beneath the matted ice and blood. The night stretched on endlessly as Sarah worked to stabilize her unexpected patient, cleaning wounds and binding ribs and wrapping the massive wolf in every warm thing she could find, checking its breathing and heart rate obsessively because she could not bear the thought of it slipping away while she was not paying attention, while she was not doing enough to save it, and somewhere in the long hours between midnight and dawn, she found herself talking to the unconscious creature, words spilling from her lips in a torrent she could not seem to stop, confessions and memories and fears she had never spoken aloud to anyone, things she would never have shared with another shifter who could judge her or use her words against her. But this wolf was unconscious and dying and would probably never remember anything she said anyway. So what did it matter if she told it about Julian's rejection, about the 5 years of wandering alone, about the crushing loneliness that made some days feel impossible to survive, about how she sometimes wondered if it would not be easier to just stop fighting and let the wilderness claim her, the way it had almost claimed this beautiful, broken creature bleeding on her cabin floor. "I have not touched another living thing in 6 months," she whispered, as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through her window, her hand still resting on the wolf's side to monitor its breathing, feeling the steady rhythm that told her it was going to survive, that her efforts had not been in vain. "Not since that trader who recoiled when I tried to hand him coins for supplies, like my touch might contaminate him somehow. Like whatever is wrong with me might be contagious, and I know that is pathetic. I know I should be stronger than this, should be able to survive without needing connection or companionship, or any of the things that normal wolves take for granted. But sometimes the loneliness is so overwhelming that I can barely breathe through it. And having you here, even like this, even unconscious and possibly dying, is the most companionship I have had in so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to care about whether another creature lived or died. The wolf's eyes opened slowly, those striking silver blue eyes focusing on her face with an intensity that should have terrified her, should have sent her scrambling backward in fear, because this was an alpha, and alphas were dangerous, and she was vulnerable and alone and completely at its mercy if it decided she was a threat. But instead of fear, what flooded through Sarah was relief so profound it made her dizzy. Relief that the wolf had survived the night, that her efforts had been enough, that she had saved a life instead of watching helplessly as another creature died. And when the wolf's gaze locked with hers, when she saw the intelligence and awareness and something that looked almost like gratitude in those otherworldly eyes, she felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope beginning to bloom in the barren wasteland her heart had become after 5 years of rejection and isolation. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice rough with exhaustion and emotion, her hand still resting on the wolf's side because she could not quite bring herself to break the physical connection, this tangible proof that she was not alone, not anymore, at least not for however long it took for this creature to heal enough to leave and return to whatever pack was missing it. "Welcome back to the land of the living, you stubborn, beautiful wolf. And now that you are awake and presumably not going to die on my floor, I need you to understand something very important." She leaned closer, holding those silver blue eyes with her own pale gray gaze, feeling the weight of what she was about to say settling over her like a physical thing. "You are not allowed to shift yet, not until you are much stronger and those ribs have had time to start healing, because shifting with broken ribs could puncture a lung and kill you. So whatever you are, whoever you are, you need to stay in this form for at least a few days, and that means you are stuck here with me and my pathetic, lonely existence. And I apologize in advance for all the things I am probably going to tell you while I think you cannot understand me, because apparently I have forgotten how to have normal boundaries after 6 months of talking only to myself." The wolf's response was a soft, chuffing sound that might have been agreement or might have been amusement, and then its eyes drifted closed again as exhaustion pulled it back toward sleep. But this time, Sarah was not afraid, because this was healing sleep, not the unconsciousness of someone slipping toward death. And she could see the slight improvement already in its breathing, in the way some tension had left its massive body, in the trust it was showing by allowing itself to be vulnerable in her presence. She settled back against the wall beside the fire, her hand still resting on the wolf's side to monitor its breathing, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath her palm. And for the first time in 6 months, possibly for the first time in 5 years, Sarah did not feel completely alone, did not feel like the last creature alive in a world that had no place for her. And even though she knew this was temporary, knew that the wolf would leave as soon as it was healed enough to travel, knew that she was setting herself up for another kind of loneliness when it inevitably abandoned her the way everyone always did. She could not bring herself to regret opening that door, could not regret the choice to save a life, even if it cost her the fragile, emotional equilibrium she had built through months of isolation. The wolf was here now, alive because of her efforts, breathing steadily beneath her hand, and whatever came next, whether it stayed for days or weeks, whether it left without a backward glance, or whether something else entirely happened that she could not begin to predict, at least she would have this moment, this proof that she was still capable of kindness, still able to save a life, still worth something, even if the only one who saw that worth was an unconscious wolf who might not even remember her once it returned to its pack and its normal life where strange-looking omegas with white hair and pale skin did not exist except as cautionary tales or objects of pity. The wolf did not leave after the first day, which surprised Sarah more than she wanted to admit. Because in her experience, creatures capable of walking away from her always did so at the earliest possible opportunity, abandoning her the moment they no longer needed whatever service or skill she could provide. And yet here was this massive white wolf with its striking silver-blue eyes, lying by her fire on the second morning after she had saved its life, watching her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced since her parents died all those years ago. She had checked its wounds at dawn, carefully peeling back the makeshift bandages she had fashioned from her spare clothes, and had been shocked to discover that the deep gash across its ribs was already beginning to knit together with the accelerated healing that marked it definitively as an alpha, the kind of powerful shifter whose very presence should have terrified a lone omega living in isolation. And yet when she ran her fingers along the healing wound, feeling for signs of infection or improper closure, the wolf had simply watched her with those knowing eyes and made a soft rumbling sound that vibrated through its massive chest like a purr, like it trusted her completely, despite having every reason not to trust a stranger who could have killed it while it was vulnerable and unconscious. "You should be shifting back to human form by now," Sarah said as she rewrapped the wound with fresh bandages, talking to the wolf because the alternative was sitting in oppressive silence, and she had discovered over the past day that she could not bear silence anymore, not when there was another living creature present to hear her voice, even if that creature could not respond in words. "Your injuries are healing remarkably fast, faster than they should be even for an alpha, which tells me you are probably someone important, someone with strong bloodlines and powerful healing abilities. And that means you have a pack waiting for you somewhere. People who are worried about you and searching for you, and probably thinking you are dead after being caught in that blizzard." She finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels, studying the wolf's face, searching those intelligent eyes for some sign of agreement or disagreement, some indication that the creature understood her and was choosing to respond or choosing not to. And what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat, because there was understanding in that gaze, clear and unmistakable understanding, along with something else that looked almost like determination, like the wolf had made a choice to stay here with her and was not going to be persuaded otherwise, regardless of what she said. The rest of that second day passed in a strange kind of domesticity that Sarah had never experienced before, not even during her brief childhood with her parents before they were killed, because this was different from family or pack. This was choosing to share space with another being who had no obligation to her, and she had no obligation to. And yet they moved around each other with an ease that felt almost choreographed, the wolf following her with its eyes as she went about her daily tasks of maintaining the fire and preparing what little food she had and melting snow for water. And once, when she had struggled to shift a heavy log closer to the hearth, the wolf had actually stood up despite its injuries and used its massive body to help her push it into place, working alongside her like they were partners rather than stranger and patient, healer and wounded. She found herself talking more as the day wore on, her usual careful guards dropping away in the face of the wolf's patient, non-judgmental presence, and she told it things she had never told anyone, confessed fears and hurts and disappointments that she had been carrying alone for so long that speaking them aloud felt like lancing an infected wound, painful but necessary, and ultimately healing in a way she had not expected. She told the wolf about Julian's rejection, about the specific words he had used and the laughter that had followed his cruel declaration, about how she had stood there in front of the entire pack in the dress her aunt had made for the ceremony, white fabric that was supposed to make her look bridal and beautiful, but had only made her look more ghostly and wrong, and how she had felt something inside her break that day. Some fundamental belief that she might someday be wanted, or loved, or chosen by someone who saw past her appearance to the person underneath. The worst part was not even the rejection itself, she admitted, as darkness fell on that second night and she settled beside the fire with the wolf's warm bulk pressed against her side, a closeness she would never have allowed if the creature had been in human form. But that felt safe and comforting when it was wearing fur instead of skin. The worst part was that deep down, I agreed with him. I looked at my reflection in the water afterwards, and I thought, yes, he is right. I do look like death. I do look unnatural and wrong, and like something that should not exist, and if I cannot even accept myself, how can I expect anyone else to accept me? The wolf made a sound low in its throat that might have been disagreement or sympathy, and it shifted position so that its massive head rested in her lap, a gesture of comfort and companionship that made tears spring to Sarah's eyes because it had been so long, so impossibly long, since anyone had offered her comfort or kindness without expecting something in return, and she found her fingers tangling in the wolf's thick white fur, stroking along its head and neck in a rhythmic motion that soothed them both. "You are a very good listener," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "And I know you probably think I am pathetic, this broken Omega living alone in a falling down cabin and talking to a wolf like it is my best friend. But right now, in this moment, you are the closest thing to a friend I have had in 5 years, and I am going to miss you terribly when you leave, which I know you will, because everyone leaves eventually. Because that is just how the world works for creatures like me who were born wrong and cursed and unwanted." The third day dawned clear and cold, the blizzard finally having blown itself out during the night, and Sarah woke to find herself curled against the wolf's side, her head pillowed on its shoulder and her body warm from the heat it radiated. And for a moment, before full consciousness returned, she felt safe and content and like she belonged somewhere, like she had found something precious that she had not even known she was searching for. But then reality crashed back in, and she scrambled away from the wolf with her cheeks burning, mortified that she had been using it as a pillow like some kind of desperate creature starved for physical contact, which was exactly what she was, but she did not need to be quite so obvious about it, and when she dared to look at the wolf's face, she found it watching her with what she could have sworn was amusement dancing in those silver blue eyes. Like it found her embarrassment entertaining rather than pathetic. "I apologize for that," she said stiffly, trying to recover some shred of dignity as she moved to build up the fire and check the wolf's injuries, which had healed so much overnight that the gash was now just a pink line across its ribs, barely even a scar, confirming what she had suspected about this being a very powerful alpha indeed. "I am not usually so clingy. I just have not been close to another living being in a very long time, and apparently my body decided to take advantage of your warmth without consulting my brain about whether that was appropriate or acceptable. So again, I apologize for any discomfort I may have caused you." The wolf's response was to stand up and deliberately press its body against her legs, leaning into her with enough weight that she had to brace herself to avoid being knocked over. And the message was clear enough that even she could not misinterpret it. The wolf was telling her that it had not minded her closeness, that perhaps it had even welcomed the contact, and something about that realization made her chest feel tight and her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. because crying would be admitting just how desperately lonely she had been, just how much these 3 days with the wolf had meant to her, and she could not afford to acknowledge those feelings when she knew the wolf would be leaving soon, returning to whatever pack and whatever life waited for it beyond her isolated cabin. "You could shift back now if you wanted to," she said as she changed the wolf's bandages for what would probably be the last time, her fingers gentle against the healing wound, memorizing the feel of the thick white fur and the warmth of the living body beneath. Because soon this would be nothing but a memory, another brief moment of connection in a lifetime defined by isolation. "Your injuries are healed enough that shifting would not cause any serious damage, and I imagine you are eager to get back to your pack, to let them know you survived the blizzard and the attack that wounded you, to reassure whoever is waiting for you that you are alive and well and on your way home." But the wolf did not shift, did not even seem to consider her suggestion. It simply settled back down beside the fire and fixed her with that intense, silver-blue gaze, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, some dangerous hope beginning to bloom despite all her efforts to crush it down. Because why would the wolf stay if it did not have to? Why would it remain here in her tiny cabin when it could return to warmth and comfort and pack? Unless perhaps it wanted to stay. Unless perhaps it had found something here worth remaining for, even if only for a little while longer. The day passed in companionable silence, punctuated by Sarah's continued monologue about nothing and everything, her voice filling the cabin as she talked about the plants she had been studying, the local wildlife she had observed, the way the mountains looked when the sun hit them at certain angles and turned the snow to gold and pink and purple. And through it all, the wolf listened with what seemed like genuine interest, its eyes tracking her movements around the small space, its presence a constant warm comfort that she was trying desperately not to become too attached to. Even though she knew it was far too late for that, she had already become attached, had already started thinking of the wolf as hers in some fundamental way that terrified her because nothing had ever been hers. Not really. Not permanently. That evening, as darkness fell for the third time since the wolf had arrived, Sarah found herself unable to maintain the cheerful facade she had been projecting, the weight of impending loss pressing down on her until she could barely breathe through it, and she sat by the fire with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to hide them because the wolf had already seen her at her worst. And what did it matter now if it saw her break down completely? "I know you have to leave," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion, her hands twisted together in her lap because she needed to hold on to something and there was nothing else to hold. "I know you have a life somewhere else, responsibilities and people who need you and probably someone waiting for you, a mate or a family or a pack that depends on you, and I have no right to want you to stay, no claim on you beyond the fact that I saved your life and you repaid me by giving me 3 days of companionship that I will treasure for the rest of my existence, even though I know that to you, this was probably just a brief interlude, a few days of forced proximity while you recovered from injuries that would have killed a lesser wolf." The tears were coming faster now, hot tracks down her cold cheeks, and she could not stop the words from spilling out, could not maintain the protective walls she had built around her heart, because this wolf had somehow slipped past all her defenses and found the lonely, desperate creature cowering inside. "I just want you to know that these 3 days have meant more to me than you could possibly understand. That having you here has reminded me what it feels like to not be completely alone. And even though I know you are going to leave, and I am going to go back to my solitary existence, where I talk to myself and slowly go mad from isolation, I will always be grateful that you stumbled to my door during that blizzard, that the moon goddess, or fate, or pure random chance gave me this brief moment of connection before returning me to the loneliness that has been my constant companion for 5 years. The wolf stood abruptly, its movements fluid and purposeful, and Sarah watched through tear-blurred eyes as it moved to the door, as it looked back at her one last time with those striking silver blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And she thought, this is it. This is goodbye. This is the moment where I lose the only friend I have had since my parents died. And she wanted to call out, wanted to beg it to stay just one more day, just a few more hours. But the words stuck in her throat because she had no right to ask for more than she had already been given. No right to demand that this creature sacrifice its own life and responsibilities just to keep a broken Omega company in her isolation. But instead of walking out the door, instead of leaving her alone in the cabin that would feel impossibly empty once the wolf's presence was gone, the creature turned back toward her, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, it began to shift, bones cracking and reforming, white fur receding to reveal pale skin, the massive wolf shape compressing and reshaping itself into the form of a man, and Sarah could only stare in shock as the transformation completed, and standing before her was the most beautiful male she had ever seen, tall and powerfully built with shoulder-length white blonde hair that was so similar to her own coloring, it made her breath catch. And when he opened his eyes and fixed her with that same intense silver blue gaze she had come to know so well over the past 3 days, she felt something fundamental shift inside her, some recognition that went bone deep and soul deep and felt like destiny finally catching up with her after years of running. "My name is Theron Frostborn," the man said, his voice deep and rich and filled with an emotion she could not quite name. "And I am the Alpha King of the Northern Crown. And before you panic or try to throw me out or apologize for everything you have said over the past 3 days, I need you to understand something crucial." He took a step toward her, moving slowly like he was afraid of startling her, and Sarah found herself frozen in place, unable to move or speak or do anything except stare at this impossibly beautiful man who had been living in her cabin as a wolf for 3 days, listening to her deepest secrets and darkest fears and most pathetic confessions. "I could have shifted back after the first day," Theron continued, his silver blue eyes never leaving hers, pinning her in place with the intensity of his gaze. "The poison that prevented my shifting was mostly purged from my system by the second morning, and I could have revealed myself then, could have explained who I was and what had happened, and arranged for my guards to come collect me. But I did not, because you were talking to me, really talking, sharing pieces of yourself that I knew instinctively you would never share with the Alpha King. And I needed to hear it, needed to know who you were when you thought no one important was listening, when you thought you were just talking to a wounded wolf who could not understand or judge or use your words against you." The confession hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her head spin with the implications, because he had known. He had understood every word she had said, every confession and fear and desperate admission, and he had chosen to remain silent, had chosen to let her pour out her heart without revealing that he was listening and comprehending every single word. You let me think you could not understand," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, anger and betrayal and something that might have been hope all warring inside her chest. "You let me tell you everything, all my pain and loneliness and the horrible things I think about myself, and you just lay there and listened and said nothing. Let me make a complete fool of myself while you judged every word I said." But even as the accusation left her lips, she saw the way Theron flinched, saw genuine pain flash across his handsome face, and she realized that whatever his reasons for remaining silent, they had not been malicious, had not been about mocking her or using her vulnerability against her. And when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion that seemed too raw and real to be faked. "I was not judging you," Theron said, and he took another step closer, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could see the way his hands were shaking slightly at his sides, like he wanted to reach for her, but was holding himself back. "I was falling in love with you, with your strength and your compassion and your beautiful broken heart that still cannot resist helping creatures in pain despite everything the world has done to you. And I knew that if I revealed myself too soon, if I told you I was the Alpha King while you were still guarded and careful, I would never get to see the real you, would never get to know the woman who sings to wounded wolves and talks to herself about plants and cries over the loneliness she has been carrying alone for far too long." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, impossible and perfect and terrifying. And Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, felt the protective numbness she had wrapped around her heart starting to crack and fall away. Because how could she maintain her defenses when he was looking at her like she was something precious? Like she was worth the 3 days he had spent listening to her ramble and confess and break down. Like everything she thought was wrong with her was actually exactly what he had been searching for. "I felt the mate bond the moment I regained consciousness in your cabin," Theron continued, his voice dropping to something almost reverent. And Sarah's heart stopped beating entirely, because mate bond, he had said mate bond, which meant he thought she was his fated mate, his one perfect match chosen by the moon goddess herself. And that could not be right, could not be possible, because broken omegas with ghostly appearances did not get to be mated to Alpha Kings. That was not how the world worked. That was not how her life had ever worked. "You are my true mate, Sarah Frost, the one I have been searching for across 6 years and countless territories, the one my mother prophesied I would find in the most unexpected place. And I know this is overwhelming, and you probably do not believe me, and you have every reason to doubt that someone like me would choose someone like you. But I am here now, standing before you in my human form, telling you the truth that I should have told you days ago." He dropped to his knees before her, this powerful Alpha King kneeling on the rough wooden floor of her cabin, and the gesture was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong according to every hierarchy and custom she had ever known, that it broke through the last of her paralysis and allowed her to actually process what he was saying, what he was offering, what impossible future he seemed to be suggesting could be theirs. "Why?" The question tore from Sarah's throat, desperate and disbelieving, because she needed to understand, needed to know why he would choose her when he could have anyone, when he was literally the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and she was nobody, nothing, a rejected Omega living in isolation because no pack had ever wanted her. "Why would you want me when you could have anyone, when you could choose from hundreds of beautiful, accomplished Omegas who would kill for the chance to be your mate and your queen, when I am just a broken thing living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere because I am too afraid of being rejected again to even try to find a pack that might tolerate my existence?" But even as she asked the question, even as she listed all the reasons why this could not be real, could not be happening, she saw the answer in his eyes, saw the genuine emotion and desire, and something that looked terrifyingly like love, and she realized that he was serious, that this was not some cruel joke or elaborate prank, that the Alpha King was actually kneeling before her and claiming her as his mate, and the knowledge of it was so overwhelming that she could barely breathe through the crushing weight of hope and terror that filled her chest. Theron reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements so she had time to pull away if she wanted to, and when she did not move, did not flinch or retreat, his hand cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes burn with fresh tears, his thumb brushing away the moisture that spilled over and tracked down her pale skin. I want you because when I was dying in the snow, you did not see an Alpha King or a powerful wolf or someone who could benefit you. You saw a soul in pain and you could not walk away. And that tells me everything I need to know about who you are at your core, he said, his voice rough with emotion, his silver blue eyes locked on hers with an intensity that felt like it was burning through every defense she had ever built. I want you because you sang to me, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Because you cried into my fur and trusted me with your deepest wounds. Because you are strong and kind and resilient, and you do not even realize it. Because when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after an endless winter. And because the mate bond is not wrong. Sarah, the moon goddess does not make mistakes, and she marked you for me just as surely as she marked me for you. His words were breaking her apart and putting her back together simultaneously, destroying the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself, while building something new and terrifying and wonderful in its place. And she found herself leaning into his touch, her body responding to him in ways her mind had not yet caught up with, drawn to him by forces she could not name or resist. I am terrified, Sarah whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her, and she saw understanding flash in Theron's eyes. Saw that he knew exactly what she meant, knew all the fears that came with accepting what he was offering. I am terrified of believing you and having you change your mind. Terrified of accepting this bond and discovering it was a mistake. Terrified of hoping for something beautiful and having it destroyed the way everything else in my life has been destroyed. And I do not know if I am strong enough to survive being rejected by my fated mate after surviving everything else I have endured. The words hung between them, raw and honest and painful, and for a moment she thought he might pull away, might realize that she was too damaged, too broken, too much work for even a patient Alpha King to want to deal with. But instead, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, the gesture intimate and grounding and filled with a promise she desperately wanted to believe in. Then we will be terrified together, Theron said softly, his breath warm against her skin, his hand still cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious. And I will spend every day for the rest of our lives proving to you that you are worthy of love and acceptance and everything good this world has to offer. And I need you to come with me, Sarah. I need you to leave this cabin and return to my palace and let me court you properly. Let me show you what your life could be. And if after giving us a real chance you decide you truly do not want this, if the mate bond does not feel right to you or you cannot see yourself as my Luna, then I will let you go. But please, please give us a chance before you make that decision. And standing there in her tiny cabin with the Alpha King kneeling before her and offering her everything she had ever wanted, but never thought she could have, Sarah felt something inside her chest crack wide open, felt all the loneliness and pain and desperate hope she had been suppressing for 5 years come flooding out, and she knew that whatever came next, whether this led to happiness or heartbreak, she could not walk away without at least trying, without at least seeing if maybe, just maybe, The moon goddess really had marked her for something more than a lifetime of isolation and rejection. And when she opened her mouth to answer him, to tell him yes or no or anything at all, a thunderous pounding echoed through the cabin as someone hammered on the door with enough force to shake the entire structure. And a voice she had never heard before shouted from outside, "Your Majesty, we have tracked you to this location. The search party awaits your orders." And Sarah's eyes went wide as she realized that the outside world was about to come crashing into the fragile bubble of possibility that had formed around them, and everything was about to change in ways she could not begin to predict or control. The royal guards who burst through her cabin door were enormous and intimidating in their white formal uniforms, their weapons gleaming in the firelight, and Sarah found herself backing away instinctively even as Theron rose to his feet with fluid grace and held up one hand to stop his men from advancing further into the small space that suddenly felt impossibly crowded with alpha energy and military precision. "Stand down," Theron commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Because this was the Alpha King now. Not the wounded wolf she had nursed back to health, or even the vulnerable man who had been kneeling before her moments ago. This was a ruler addressing his soldiers, and the transformation was both terrifying and magnificent to witness. "Captain Rowan, I appreciate your diligence in tracking me down. But as you can see, I am alive and well, and I need you and your men to wait outside while I conclude a very important conversation with the woman who saved my life and who deserves far more courtesy than having armed guards storming into her home uninvited." The captain, a grizzled older wolf with scars marking his weathered face and an air of having seen countless battles, took in the scene before him with sharp eyes that missed nothing, his gaze moving from Theron's protective stance to Sarah's pale, shocked face to the makeshift bandages still scattered around the cabin. And something in his expression softened with what might have been understanding or approval before he bowed deeply and gestured for his men to retreat. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," Captain Rowan said, his voice gruff but respectful, and his eyes found Sarah's for just a moment, holding her gaze with an intensity that felt like assessment and acknowledgement combined. "We have been searching for 3 days since the blizzard hit, and feared the worst when we could not locate you or find any trace of your survival. But clearly you were in exceptional hands, and we will await your orders outside." The guards filed out with military precision, but Sarah noticed that the captain paused in the doorway, looking back at her with something that might have been gratitude or respect. And she realized with a jolt that these wolves knew exactly how close their king had come to dying. Knew that if she had not opened her door during that storm, if she had not spent 3 days keeping him alive, they would be returning to their kingdom with news of their ruler's death instead of celebrating his survival. The door closed behind the last guard, leaving Sarah and Theron alone once more in the sudden silence that felt deafening after the commotion, and she found herself unable to meet his eyes. Unable to process the reality that had just crashed into her tiny cabin in the form of a dozen royal guards who served the man standing before her. The man who claimed she was his fated mate. The man who wanted to take her away from this isolated existence and make her a queen. "I know this is overwhelming," Theron said softly, moving toward her slowly like he was approaching a skittish animal that might bolt at any sudden movement, and perhaps that assessment was not far from the truth, because Sarah could feel panic rising in her chest, could feel the urge to run building in her muscles, even though there was nowhere to run to. No escape from the impossible situation she found herself in. "I know having my guards arrive like that was jarring, and probably made all of this feel too real too fast. But Sarah, I need you to understand That what I said before they arrived, what I offered you, none of that has changed. I still want you to come with me, still want to court you properly and show you what your life could be if you choose to accept the mate bond. And I am not going to force you or pressure you or do anything except ask you to please. Please give us a chance before you let fear make your decision for you. His words were earnest and pleading, and when Sarah finally looked up at him, she saw genuine worry in those silver blue eyes. Saw that he was afraid she would refuse him, would choose to stay in her isolated cabin rather than risk the heartbreak that might come from accepting what he offered. And something about seeing that vulnerability in someone so powerful made it easier to breathe, made it possible to think past the panic that had been threatening to drown her. "If I go with you," Sarah heard herself saying, the words emerging hesitantly like she was testing their weight and shape. "If I agree to come to your palace and let you court me, what happens when your kingdom sees me and decides I am not suitable to be their Luna? What happens when your council looks at my appearance and my complete lack of status or training, or anything that would make me qualified to stand beside a king?" The fear in her voice was raw and unmistakable, and she saw Theron's jaw clench with barely suppressed anger, though she knew instinctively that the anger was not directed at her, but at every person who had ever made her feel less than worthy, every wolf who had looked at her and found her wanting. "I have spent my entire life being rejected and cast aside because of how I look, because of this pale skin and white hair that makes people uncomfortable. And I cannot survive being rejected by an entire kingdom, Theron. I cannot stand in front of thousands of wolves and see that same disgust and pity and discomfort that I saw in Julian's eyes when he looked at me on what should have been our mating day." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and unchecked, and she made no effort to wipe them away, because what was the point of hiding her pain from someone who had already seen her at her lowest, who had listened to her darkest confessions, and apparently loved her anyway? Theron closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, wrapping her in warmth and strength, and the undeniable sense of safety that came from being held by someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. And Sarah found herself melting into his embrace despite all her fears and doubts, found her body responding to his presence in ways that had nothing to do with conscious thought and everything to do with the mate bond that hummed between them like a living thing. "Listen to me very carefully," Theron said, his voice rumbling through his chest where her ear was pressed against it, the sound and sensation grounding her in the present moment. "My mother was a seer, gifted by the moon goddess with the ability to see fragments of the future. And before she died, she told me that I would find my mate in the most unexpected place, that she would be pale as winter, with hair like fresh snow and eyes like storm clouds, and that she would save my life, and I would spend the rest of mine proving her worth to her, because she would not believe in it herself." Sarah's breath caught in her throat because that description was unmistakably her, down to details that no one could have guessed or fabricated, and the implications of what he was saying made her head spin with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "You are not a mistake, Sarah. You are not wrong, or cursed, or any of the horrible things people have made you believe about yourself. You were marked by the moon goddess herself, chosen and shaped specifically to be my mate, and your appearance is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated because it marks you as special, as set apart, as mine." The possessiveness in that last word should probably have alarmed her, should have triggered all her carefully honed wariness about alphas who thought they could claim ownership over omegas, but instead It sent warmth flooding through her entire body, made something deep inside her chest unfurl, and reached toward him like a flower turning toward the sun. "What if I fail you?" Sarah whispered against his chest, voicing the fear that lived at the very core of her being, the terror that even if he wanted her now, even if the mate bond was real and strong, eventually he would realize that she was not enough, that she could not be the Luna his kingdom needed, that choosing her had been a mistake he would come to regret. "What if I cannot be what you need me to be? Cannot learn to navigate court politics, or win over your council, or do any of the things that queens are supposed to do? What if I embarrass you, or make you wish you had chosen someone stronger, someone better, someone who was not so fundamentally broken by years of rejection and isolation?" But even as the words left her mouth, even as she tried to list all the ways she might disappoint him, Theron was pulling back just enough to frame her face with both his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes, to see the absolute conviction blazing in that silver-blue gaze. "Then we will figure it out together," Theron said firmly, his thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. The contrast between his careful touch and the strength she could feel coiled in his body, making her feel both protected and cherished in ways she had never experienced before. "You are not going into this alone, Sarah. You will have me beside you every step of the way, teaching you what you need to know and supporting you through every challenge and defending you against anyone who dares to question your worth. And more than that, you will have allies in my court, people like Captain Rowan, who already respect you for saving their king's life, healers who will recognize your gift and want to learn from you, wolves who will see your compassion and kindness and understand why I chose you." He leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, the gesture intimate and grounding, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be yourself, to bring your beautiful, compassionate heart into my life and my kingdom, and let me spend every day showing you that you are exactly what we need, exactly what I need. And if you stumble or struggle or need time to adjust, then we will take that time. We will move at whatever pace you need. But please, Sarah, please do not let fear of potential failure stop you from even trying. Do not let the ghosts of past rejection steal this chance at happiness before you have even given it an opportunity to grow into something real and lasting and beautiful." Standing there in her cabin with this powerful man offering her everything she had ever wanted but never thought she deserved, Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumbling away, felt the walls she had built around her heart finally shattering under the weight of his patient devotion and unwavering certainty that she was worth fighting for. "I am still terrified," she admitted, but there was something different in her voice now, something that might have been hope beginning to take root in soil that had been barren for far too long. "I am terrified of hoping for this and having it taken away, terrified of believing I could actually be loved and valued and wanted only to discover it was temporary or conditional or dependent on me being something other than what I am. But I think I am more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to say yes, if I had been strong enough to take this chance you are offering me." She took a shaky breath, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump into unknown waters, trusting that Theron would be there to catch her, even though every past experience told her that people always let her fall. "So yes, I will come with you. I will go to your palace, and let you court me, and try to believe that maybe, just maybe, the moon goddess really did intend for us to be together. And if it does not work out, if I prove to be unsuitable, or your kingdom rejects me, or any of the 1,000 things I am afraid of actually happen, at least I will know that I tried, that I was brave enough to reach for something beautiful, even though reaching had always ended in pain before. The smile that spread across Theron's face was radiant enough to light up the dim cabin, and before Sarah could process what was happening, he had swept her up into his arms and was spinning her around, laughing with pure joy that was so infectious she found herself laughing too, despite the tears still streaming down her face. And when he finally set her down and kissed her, really kissed her for the first time, with nothing held back and no more barriers between them, the mate bond flared so brilliantly that Sarah gasped against his mouth, feeling the connection snap into place with an intensity that stole her breath and made her entire body feel like it was burning and freezing simultaneously in the most exquisite way imaginable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the bond's energy, Theron rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough to choose me, for choosing us, and I promise you that I will spend every day for the rest of our lives making sure you never regret this decision, making sure you know how precious and valuable and absolutely irreplaceable you are, not just to me, but to everyone whose life you touch with your compassion and healing gifts." The journey to the Frostborn Palace took 4 days, and Sarah spent those days getting to know not just Theron, but also the guards who traveled with them, warriors who had served the royal family for decades and who treated her with a respect that shocked her because she had never been treated with respect by anyone except her parents, had never been looked at like she mattered, or like her presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. Captain Rowan in particular seemed determined to make her feel welcome, sharing stories about Theron's childhood and the late Queen's prophecies. And Sarah found herself warming to the gruff old soldier who clearly loved his king and was willing to extend that protective devotion to the woman Theron had chosen as his mate. When the palace finally came into view, rising from the mountainside like something out of a fairy tale, with its crystalline towers catching the afternoon sun and throwing rainbows across the snow-covered landscape, Sarah felt terror and wonder warring in her chest. Because this was going to be her home if she accepted the mate bond permanently. This magnificent structure filled with hundreds of wolves who would all be watching and judging and deciding whether she was worthy of their king. And the weight of that responsibility felt crushing, even as Theron's hand found hers and squeezed gently, reminding her that she was not facing this alone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments and challenges, and moments of surprising joy, as Sarah learned to navigate palace life with Theron at her side, patient and supportive, and never pushing her faster than she could handle. She met Elder Maya, the palace's head healer, who took one look at Sarah's natural gifts and immediately claimed her as an apprentice, spending hours teaching her advanced techniques and introducing her to the other healers who were initially wary of her strange appearance, but quickly came to respect her skill and dedication. She attended council meetings where she was expected to simply observe, but found herself offering suggestions that were occasionally implemented with surprisingly positive results, earning grudging respect from advisors who had initially dismissed her as just a pretty distraction for their king. She learned to dress in the flowing gowns that were appropriate for someone of her new status, discovering that certain colors and fabrics could make her pale coloring look ethereal and beautiful, rather than sickly and wrong. And the first time Theron saw her in a silver gown that complemented her winter coloring, his reaction had been so visceral, so full of desire and reverence, that she had finally begun to believe that maybe he really did find her beautiful. That maybe her appearance was not the curse she had always believed it to be? But it was the small moments that truly won her over. The private evenings when Theron would read to her from his extensive library, the walks through the ice gardens where he would point out plants and tell her stories about their medicinal properties because he remembered how much she loved healing work, the nights when she woke from nightmares about being rejected and found him immediately there to hold her and remind her that she was safe and wanted and home. And slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice it happening, Sarah began to heal from the wounds that years of rejection had carved into her soul, began to believe that she deserved the love and acceptance Theron offered so freely, began to see herself through his eyes rather than through the cruel assessments of wolves who had never bothered to look past her surface to see the person underneath. 3 months after arriving at the palace, Sarah woke one morning and realized with startling clarity that she was happy, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since her parents died. And when Theron asked her that evening if she was ready to accept the mate bond permanently, to undergo the formal mating ceremony that would make her his Luna and queen before the entire kingdom, she found herself saying yes without hesitation, without the crippling fear that had defined so much of her life, because she finally understood that she was worthy of this love, this life, this future that seemed too beautiful to be real, but was happening anyway. The mating ceremony was held under the full moon, with the entire kingdom gathered to witness their alpha king claim his chosen mate. And Sarah wore a gown of white and silver that made her look like winter personified, her pale hair adorned with crystals that caught the moonlight and threw it back in sparkling waves that made the assembled wolves gasp with wonder rather than discomfort. When Theron marked her neck, his teeth breaking her skin and the mate bond snapping into place with enough force to make them both stagger, Sarah felt complete for the first time in her life, felt like she had finally found the home she had been searching for in the form of this man who had seen her at her absolute worst and loved her anyway, who had listened to her darkest secrets and declared them beautiful, who had chosen her not despite her differences, but because of them. The kingdom's acceptance came more slowly. There were still wolves who whispered about her appearance or questioned her suitability, but with Theron's unwavering support and her own growing confidence, Sarah gradually won them over through her compassion and healing work and the genuine care she showed for even the lowest Omega in the kingdom. And by the time their first child was born 2 years later, a daughter with white blonde hair and her mother's pale coloring, the entire kingdom had come to love their unusual Luna, who proved that true strength came not from physical power, but from the courage to remain kind in a world that often rewarded cruelty. Years later, when young Omegas would come to Luna Sarah, feeling broken or unwanted, or convinced they were cursed because they looked different or did not fit the standard molds of beauty and acceptability, she would take their hands and tell them her story, the tale of a rejected Omega who lived alone in a mountain cabin and saved a freezing wolf during a blizzard, never knowing that 3 days later, the Alpha King would knock on her door and change her entire life. "I spent 5 years believing I was worthless," she would tell them, her voice gentle but firm, her pale eyes holding theirs with understanding, born from shared pain. "I spent 5 years thinking that my appearance made me unlovable, that I was destined to die alone and unwanted, that the moon goddess had cursed me by making me different from everyone else. But I was wrong about all of it, because what I thought was a curse was actually the moon goddess marking me for something extraordinary, marking me so that my true mate would recognize me instantly, marking me as special rather than strange, as chosen rather than rejected. And those young wolves would leave her presence standing taller and believing more firmly in their own worth, carrying with them the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone was waiting for them. Someone who would see their differences and call them beautiful. Someone who would choose them not despite their uniqueness, but because of it. And all they had to do was survive long enough and remain kind enough and be brave enough to open the door when destiny came knocking during a blizzard, because you never knew when the freezing wolf on your doorstep might actually be your future, your home, your everything wrapped in fur and waiting for you to be brave enough to let it in. If you enjoyed Sarah and Theron's story of second chances and finding love in the most unexpected places, I would be absolutely thrilled if you would take a moment to leave a comment below telling me what you thought. Which moments resonated with you most deeply? Whether Sarah's journey from isolation to acceptance touched your heart the way I hoped it would. And what other kinds of werewolf romance stories you would like to see in the future. Because your feedback and suggestions are what inspire me to keep creating these tales of fated mates and alpha kings and omegas who discover their own strength through love. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story, because I have so many more tales to tell about rejected mates finding their true destinies, about powerful alphas who fall for unexpected omegas, about the magic that happens when two souls recognize each other across impossible odds. And I want you to be there for every single one of them, to journey with me through these worlds where love conquers fear and kindness is the greatest strength, and everyone, no matter how broken or different or convinced they are unworthy, eventually finds their home. Hit that notification bell, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and thank you, truly thank you, for reading Sarah and Theron's story and for being part of this community that celebrates love in all its forms, because your support means everything and makes it possible for me to keep writing these stories that I hope bring you as much joy to read as they bring me to create, and I cannot wait to share the next tale with you. So I will see you very soon in another story of werewolves and destined love and the extraordinary things that happen when we are brave enough to open our doors to the freezing wolves that fate sends our way.